Welcome back. 183 days are left before Election Day, and there's a growing concern among Republicans that Democrats are in a real position to flip the Senate blue. In fact, Georgia Senator David Perdue, who's a Republican and up for re-election, he issued a blunt warning to GOP activists. Perdue saying that the threat is real in his state, and he's concerned that Democrats could take back the U.S. Senate. A recent poll from NBC and the Wall Street Journal shows Joe Biden leading President Trump by 6 points in those 11 key states that'll probably determine the winner come November. This, as the political landscape for Republican senators has become more challenging. You have incumbents in Colorado and Arizona, Maine and North Carolina. They've got tough paths to re-election as we speak. And now, add to that, Republicans in more conservative states like Iowa, Montana, even Kansas, saying they feel threatened as well. I want to bring in my next guest, Dan Sena. He's a Democratic strategist, and he was executive director of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee back in 2018 when the Dems flipped the House from red to blue. And obviously, Dan, the landscape very different. Obviously, COVID not on the radar 2 years ago, but nonetheless, do you see some of the same kind of telltale signs here that there's going to be a lot of vulnerable Republicans this time around, and the top of the ticket's going to probably hurt more than it helps?
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to see you. Well, look, I think a few things. First, it's very early. It's still early in the cycle, and we're dealing with obviously a historic pandemic with COVID. And so the playbook of what's to come is still very much in development. I will say, I think the Democrats have done a great job of recruitment in Colorado. They've done a great job of recruitment in Arizona. That puts those two seats in a lean to likely Democratic category, which then really opens up the door for what I think is incredibly competitive races, in particular in North Carolina, in particular in Montana with Stephen Bullock's candidacy. You know, a statewide candidate in a relatively red place that's already run and won statewide twice and already shares the values with the state. So I think the Democrats are going to be knocking on the door of a 50-50 Senate chamber here by early summer.
To that end, is this all about COVID now? I mean, you know, I guess it'll depend when people go to the polls, not just how their pocketbooks are impacted, but also on leadership, faith in government, and all those other things. How do you think, and again, I know we're only sitting here in early May, Dan, but nonetheless, how much is it going to be about that instead of issues we thought this would be about, healthcare, economy, just a few months ago?
Well, I think what you're going to see is you're going to see message frames and the importance of issues that touch COVID. So I think you're going to see an awful lot about what the country looks like when we go back to work. I think you're going to see an awful lot of, rather than these big sort of presidential aspirational messages, I think you're going to see an awful lot of messaging around what 21 looks like for both your pocketbook, but also your prescription drug costs and your healthcare costs. So I think you're going to see message arcs from all of these candidates really centered around how they're going to deal with what life is like when it goes back to somewhat normal. I will say, and I think you hit the nail on the head, I do think people's experiences, their records of service, how they've not only worked in government, but how they worked in things that touch government, I think we're going to see play a more important role than we've seen in prior elections, where the emphasis was really more on independence, being an outsider looking in. You know, I think your experience now with the institutions that touch government, healthcare, and jobs, I think are going to play critical roles in 20.
I think a common mistake a lot of people make is they see AOC or the squad, and they thought that was basically the whole wave of freshmen that came in 2 years ago, when in actuality, it was many more moderates that made up that freshman class. To that end, could we almost see a reverse now, where I could see this New Deal idea, especially if we're in the throes, God forbid, of a depression or whatever else here, Dan, that some of those big ticket ideas like healthcare for all, which I thought would have been non-starters even 4 or 5 months ago, I could see there being an appetite nationally for something like that. Am I getting too far ahead of my skis?
No, I think there is definitely some truth to what you're saying. I think in particular around healthcare, how people get access to healthcare, I think you're going to see an openness amongst the electorate to have that discussion. I will be cautious about going too far to kicking people off coverage and those types of things, but I do think you're going to see a much more detailed plan from both candidates for president at this point, members of Congress and people running for the Senate, around the role that healthcare plays in people's individual lives. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see it move just as an inch or two to the left.
Obviously, the top of the ticket cuts both ways. Biden has been largely, MIA, or you can argue, what can you really do from a basement during a pandemic? You can also argue that President Trump's making his job pretty easy by seemingly, stepping in it every day. All that said, what kind of a campaign would you advise Biden to run? You got to be a little careful. You're not attacking a president too much in the middle of a crisis, but on the same end, don't you have to point out how different it would be if you were in charge?
Well, that's a great question. I think first and foremost, it's going to be critical for the Biden campaign to establish a positive narrative and a purpose for their candidacy that is different than what we've seen thus far. And what I mean by that is something that is much more general election focused, a message frame that is built really around building a larger coalition than Democratic primary voters. And I believe they're on the right track for starting with. Look, we're running in unexpected times, and many of these campaigns across the country now, he's not the only candidate who's found themselves sort of pinned down in a library or across the kitchen table. I think the next phase of this campaign is really about bringing validators, bringing people together to help tell Biden's story, and really establish a drumbeat and a connection to voters across the country who, frankly, are not only worried about their health, but they're very, very nervous about what the economy looks like for them.
I thought a little bit about when we had the crash in '08. There was that tangible moment where both Obama and McCain went, and apparently, from all accounts here, there was a huge distinction between how prepared either man was for what they would inherit. And that filtered out. I don't know how much that may have changed too many votes, but a lot of people who are wondering if Obama's experience would maybe lend himself to being ready for the moment. It's kind of like the reverse that Biden would say. He knows government inside and out, but I think he's got to articulate a little better. To that end, running mate. There's a poll out that's got Senator Warren here on top of a CBS poll on who we ought to pick as his running mate. I would be surprised if that was the other part of the ticket. Who would you think does him the most good? A Kamala Harris, a Klobuchar? Give me the name that you think either we've heard or haven't heard enough that would probably best complement him.
Look, I could be wrong. I think it really comes down to two different folks. I think Kamala Harris brings an awful lot to the ticket for him. I think she not only brings the ability to motivate younger voters, she's clearly a fresh face. Ideologically, they're not too far apart. She brings a finance operation, the ability to raise, and then also motivate, I think, really younger voters under the age of 50, and obviously African Americans and voters of color across the country in a way that I think is something that would be helpful to the ticket and obviously very helpful to Joe Biden. I do think this pick is going to matter more than at least in the time being right now. It's going to matter more than prior vice presidential picks, meaning I think it's going to be paid more attention to. I think in particular because both Donald Trump and Joe Biden are a bit older for the presidency. So with that, I also can see the strategy behind somebody like Amy Klobuchar, who honestly just sits in the Midwest. You can deploy both strategies of really bearing down in the Rust Belt states and allowing her to speak Minnesota to Wisconsin and to Michigan, which I don't have to tell you. If you win both of those states, then the road to the White House is much easier.
Hey, Dan, appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone, when we come back, we know that the country is incredibly balkanized as we speak, even as a pandemic has become a political battleground. But it may be even worse than you think. After the break, we're going to show you what one particular Fair and Balanced channel is saying about COVID and how blindly its viewers tend to follow their favorite network.